What are you doing inside this house?
I'm unlocking my property.
We got a call about a break-in. Neighbor says you forced entry.
I used the key.
Then why does it look like you were sneaking in?
I wasn't sneaking anywhere. I own this house.
Yeah? Got proof of that?
These are my keys.
Keys don't mean ownership. Anyone can have keys.
I am the landlord.
He was holding his own keys. Let that sit for a moment. Not a crowbar, not a credit card being run along a door frame, not any of the tools that a person actually breaking into a home might use. He was holding a key ring, a worn, practical, ordinary key ring with 7 keys on it, the kind accumulated over years of owning property, of building something, of being the person responsible for a set of doors in the world. He had already used one of those keys. He had used it to open the front door of a house he had owned for 11 years. He was standing in the doorway, half in, half out, when the squad car pulled up. His name was Ezra Beaumont, 44 years old, owner of 14 rental properties across 2 counties in the greater Columbus, Ohio metropolitan area. A man who had spent 2 decades building a real estate portfolio from a single duplex, purchased with savings accumulated over 6 years of working construction, teaching himself property law at a library table on Thursday nights, and refusing, with a discipline that people who knew him described as almost spiritual, to let the distance between where he started and where he wanted to be become a reason to stop moving. He owned the house, he had a key, he was using it, and within 4 minutes of the squad car pulling up, he was face down on his own front lawn with a knee on his back and his hands being zip-tied behind him while his neighbors watched from their porches, and a rookie officer named Tyler Graves told the man who owned the house, whose name was on the deed, whose key was still in the lock, to stop resisting. He was not resisting. He was trying to breathe. What happened in the next 52 minutes would result in a federal civil rights lawsuit, a 6-figure settlement, a departmental investigation that revealed a pattern of racially disparate response calls in the district, and a public reckoning that the Columbus Division of Police described in their own internal documents as a moment of significant institutional vulnerability. What it would not result in, what no settlement and no policy and no official statement could produce, was the return of the 11 years of dignity Ezra Beaumont had built in that neighborhood, the neighborhood where his tenants lived, the neighborhood where people knew his name, the neighborhood where he was now, in the span of 4 minutes, something else entirely. Before we continue, what city are you watching from? If this is your first time here, support the channel by liking and subscribing. Stories like this need to be heard, and with your help, we can make sure these events don't go unheard. Because this story doesn't start with a squad car. It starts with a phone call, and who made it, and why, and what it says about all of us that a black man opening his own front door is a call worth making. To understand what Ezra Beaumont lost in those 52 minutes, you have to understand what it took to build. He grew up in Linden, Columbus's northeast side, a neighborhood that the city's investment maps had historically treated as an edge case. Resources flowing toward the short north, the suburbs, the corridors that generated tax revenue and press coverage, and the kind of development that attracted cameras. Linden got the remainder, but it also produced people. Ezra's father was a plumber, a union man, meticulous and principled, who talked about his work the way other men talked about philosophy, with the conviction that doing a thing correctly was its own form of integrity, and that the world was built and maintained by people who showed up and did it right. He took Ezra on jobs from the time Ezra was 11, not to train him as a plumber specifically, to train him as someone who understood how buildings worked from the inside out. It was, unintentionally, the most valuable education Ezra ever received. He graduated from Linden McKinley High School and enrolled at Columbus State for 2 years before transferring to Ohio State, where he studied business administration with a concentration in real estate finance. He paid for it himself, working construction during the day and taking classes at night, sleeping less than most people thought was survivable, eating with the economy of someone for whom every dollar had a job to do. He graduated at 26. He bought his first property at 28, a duplex on Maplewood Avenue in a neighborhood that had seen better decades but still had good bones. He knew about good bones. His father had taught him. He repaired it himself. He rented both units within 60 days. He saved the cash flow, reinvested it, leveraged it into a second property 2 years later. He was methodical, patient, precise. By 35, he had 6 properties. By 40, 12. By 44, the age at which Officer Tyler Graves put a knee on his back, he owned 14 properties, had 14 sets of tenants he considered himself responsible for, and had been a presence in the Columbus residential real estate market long enough that agents, inspectors, and contractors knew his name and his standards. He was also, by any honest assessment, the kind of landlord that tenants prayed to get. He responded to maintenance requests within 24 hours. He kept rents below market rate because he believed, and said openly, that displacement was a form of violence. He knew his tenants by name. He knew their kids. He attended 2 tenant funerals in 11 years because that's the kind of landlord he was, the kind who showed up. The property on Sycamore Glen Drive, the one where he was standing in the doorway on a Thursday afternoon in September, had been in his portfolio for 11 years, his longest held property. A 3-bedroom colonial that he had purchased, renovated, and maintained with a care that the neighbors had noticed and appreciated. The current tenants, a family named the Washingtons, had lived there for 3 years. Good people, reliable, the kind of tenant-landlord relationship that worked because both parties respected what the other had invested. The Washingtons were on vacation. The gutters needed emergency repair before a forecasted weekend storm. Ezra had a key. He always had a key. He was going in to assess the access point for the gutter work. He used his key. He opened the door. He was standing in the doorway in his house on his property, when the squad car arrived. Let's build this neighborhood, because the neighborhood matters. Sycamore Glen is a residential district on Columbus's west side, the kind of neighborhood that sits at the intersection of established and evolving. Ranch homes and colonials from the 1970s and 80s, most of them well-maintained, many of them recently updated by owners who had bought in the last decade when prices were still accessible. A mixed neighborhood in the truest sense, racially, economically, generationally. The kind of street where the woman on one end has lived there for 40 years and the couple on the other end moved in 18 months ago, and they all still wave at each other. It was a Thursday afternoon, September. That specific quality of late summer light that makes everything look slightly more golden than it is. Warm, clear. The kind of afternoon that invites open windows and front porch sitting. Ezra had parked in the driveway, his truck, a gray Ford F-150 with his company name Beaumont Property Group printed on the door panel in clean block letters. He had the key ring in his hand before he reached the porch. He had been to this house dozens of times. The porch had a slight creak on the 3rd step. He'd been meaning to fix it for a year, kept getting outpaced by other repairs. He noted it again as he climbed the steps. He unlocked the door. He pushed it open. He was standing in the threshold, one hand on the door frame, visually scanning the interior to orient himself before going in, checking the entryway, the light, the general condition, when he heard the car. He turned, squad car, crawling, the particular slow roll of a vehicle assessing a situation before committing to it. It stopped at the curb. Officer Tyler Graves got out, 24 years old, 11 months on the force, assigned to the Sycamore Glen Patrol District for 4 months. He had responded to a call, a 911 call as it turned out, placed by a neighbor, reporting a suspicious individual attempting to break into a home on Sycamore Glen Drive. The caller had described a black man trying to enter the property. They had not mentioned the key. They had not mentioned the truck with the company name on the door. They had not called to ask questions or gather context. They had called to report, and Tyler Graves, 11 months into a career and still running on the adrenaline of authority that hasn't yet been tempered by wisdom, pulled up to a house where a black man was standing in an open doorway and made, in the time it takes to open a car door, a decision about what he was looking at. He was not looking at a landlord. He did not see a landlord. He saw what the caller had described, and he acted on it with the speed of someone who had not yet learned that the fastest response and the right response are rarely the same thing. Graves crossed the lawn fast, not running. The controlled fast of an officer who has been trained to project command presence, purposeful, forward, authoritative. His hand was not on his weapon, it was at his side, fingers open, the posture of someone prepared for escalation without having committed to it yet. He said, "Hey, stop, don't move." Ezra turned fully to face him. He had not been moving. He had been standing in a doorway. He was now standing on the porch, facing the officer, hands visible, one of which still held the key ring. He said, "Can I help you? Step away from the door. This is my property. I'm the owner." Graves stopped 4 feet from the porch steps. He looked at Ezra. He looked at the open door behind him. He looked at the key ring. None of it computed the way it should have, because he had already decided, in the 30 seconds between the car door and this moment, what the situation was. And once a mind has decided, evidence becomes something to argue with rather than something to learn from. "I'm going to need you to step down off that porch." "Officer, my name is Ezra Beaumont. I own this property. My company name is on the truck in the driveway. I have a key." "Sir, step down off the porch now." There is a particular dehumanization in being interrupted when you are trying to provide the information that resolves the situation. The interruption is not incidental, it is functional. It prevents the evidence from arriving. It keeps the assumption intact. Ezra stepped down off the porch. He was complying, visibly, documentably complying. He stepped down, both hands visible, key ring in his right hand, and said again, with the controlled patience of a man who had navigated these moments before and knew that patience was not optional, it was survival. "I own this property. I have documentation. It is in my truck. My company name is on the truck door, Beaumont Property Group. If you run that name, you will find 14 registered properties in Franklin County, including this address. I have a key because I am the owner and I am here to assess maintenance work." Graves said, "I need you to put the keys down." Ezra looked at him. He placed the keys on the porch step. He put his hands up. And somehow, this was not enough. Graves called for backup. Not because Ezra had moved, not because he had threatened anyone or attempted to flee or done anything that a reasonable officer, assessing the observable evidence, could characterize as threatening. He called because he had a black man and an open door and a story that didn't fit the narrative he'd arrived with, and he wasn't equipped, by training, by temperament, or by experience, to resolve that dissonance on his own. Backup arrived in 6 minutes. Officer Sandra Okafor and Officer Jim Beal, both senior to Graves, both more experienced, both, by the account of witnesses, visibly assessing the scene with the kind of measured attention that Graves had not applied. Okafor looked at the truck. Beaumont Property Group, clear, on the door. She looked at Ezra, hands raised, standing on the lawn, composure intact, despite everything. She looked at Graves. She said quietly, "What do we have?" Graves said, "Possible B and E. Suspect claims to be the owner." Suspect. The word sat there. A man standing in his own driveway with a company truck behind him had been designated a suspect by a person 11 months into a career who had not yet verified a single piece of the information available to him. Okafor looked at Ezra. "Sir, can you tell me your name and your relationship to this property?" Ezra, still with his hands raised, said, "Ezra Beaumont. I own this property. It is registered to Beaumont Property Group, Franklin County. My company's name is on that truck. I have the property deed, the mortgage documentation, and a maintenance log in my glove compartment. I have a key which I placed on the porch step when your colleague asked me to." Okafor nodded slowly. She turned to Graves. He said, "We should secure him while we verify." She looked at him for a moment. Then, and this is the decision that will live in the record of this case, the decision that transformed a misunderstanding into a civil rights violation, the decision that a more experienced or more thoughtful officer might have made differently. She deferred. She was senior, She had the power to say, no, we don't secure a man on his own property based on no evidence. We verify first and then we reassess. She deferred to the rookie who had started it, and Ezra Beaumont went face down on his own front lawn. This is the part of the story that needs to be told slowly, because the instinct is to move past it, to get to the resolution, the credentials, the reversal, to give the reader the relief of the correction, because the correction is coming and we know it, and sitting in the injustice is uncomfortable. Sit in it. 44 years old, 2 decades of work, 14 properties, a company name on a truck door, a key on a porch step, hands raised, voice level, complying with every instruction, face down on the lawn, zip ties on his wrists, a knee on his back, neighbors on their porches, and Ezra Beaumont, who had spent 11 years in this neighborhood, who had fixed the gutters and maintained the foundation and kept the rents accessible and attended the funerals, was lying on the grass of a house he owned while the people who lived near him watched. He said, from the ground, with a measured precision that deserves to be recorded and remembered, I am not resisting, I am complying. My name is Ezra Beaumont. I am the owner of this property. Everything you need to verify that is in my truck. Graves said, stop talking. He stopped talking. He lay on the ground. He waited. 2 doors down, a woman named Gloria Simmons, 73 years old, retired school teacher, 11 years on Sycamore Glen Drive, had come out onto her porch when she heard the commotion. She had seen Ezra Beaumont on that property dozens of times. She knew his truck. She knew his face. She knew his name. She called out from her porch, "That's Mr. Beaumont. He owns that house. What are you doing?" Graves looked at her. He said, "Ma'am, please go inside." She did not go inside. She pulled out her phone. She called 311, the city's non-emergency line, and reported in real time that a black property owner was being restrained on his own lawn by Columbus Division of Police officers who had not verified his identity. She stayed on the line for 11 minutes. She also, because Gloria Simmons was a woman who understood that documentation was the difference between what happened and what could be proven, asked her granddaughter, who had come out behind her, to start filming. The granddaughter was 19. She pressed record. Officer Okafor walked to the truck. She read the door. Beaumont Property Group. A phone number, a website. She pulled out her phone and ran the business name through the county property record system, a search that took 47 seconds and returned a list of 14 registered properties in Franklin County, Ohio, the first of which was the address on Sycamore Glen Drive, registered owner, Ezra L. Beaumont. She walked back to where Graves was standing over Ezra. She said, "The property is registered to him." Graves said nothing. She said, "Cut the zip ties." He said, "We should still..." She said, "Cut them, now." The zip ties were cut. Ezra was helped to his feet by Okafor, who extended a hand, which he took because declining it would have cost him more energy than accepting it, and he was conserving every remaining unit of energy for what came next. He stood, he straightened his shirt, he looked at Graves, he said, and Gloria Simmons' granddaughter was filming and the audio was clear. "I told you who I was from the moment you arrived." Graves said, "Sir, we received a call." "I know you received a call. I'm telling you what that call should have prompted, which was a question, not a takedown, a question. Did you ask me one question that was designed to actually verify my identity before you put me on the ground?" Silence. The kind of silence that is itself an answer. Ezra picked up his key ring from the porch step. He looked at his house. He looked at the lawn, the indentation in the grass where his body had been pressed. He looked at the neighbors on their porches. He said nothing else. He walked to his truck. He sat in the driver's seat. He called his attorney. Her name was Imani Simmons, 19 years old, home for the weekend from her first semester at Ohio State, the same school Ezra Beaumont had attended, the same school that sat 15 minutes from the house where her grandmother had watched a property owner get zip-tied on his own lawn. She had 4 minutes and 8 seconds of footage. It began with Ezra on the ground. It captured Okafor's walk to the truck. It captured the property record search. It captured the zip ties being cut. It captured Ezra standing, straightening his shirt, asking the question that Graves couldn't answer. It captured the silence. She posted it that evening with a caption that was careful, factual, and devastating in its simplicity. This happened on my grandmother's street today. The man being zip-tied owns the house. His company name is literally on his truck. Columbus police were called because a neighbor saw a black man opening a door. This is what that costs. By morning, 9 million views. By afternoon, 26 million. By the time the Columbus Division of Police Communications Office arrived at work the following day, there were 412 media requests in the inbox. 3 city council members had issued statements, and the police chief's office had received direct calls from 2 state legislators and a congressional staffer. The Columbus Dispatch ran the story on the front page. The Associated Press picked it up. Within 48 hours, it was international. And the neighbor who had made the call, who had seen a black man opening a door and decided without a question or a knock or a single word exchange that it warranted a 911 response, released a statement through a lawyer that described their actions as a good faith attempt to protect the neighborhood they had shared with Ezra Beaumont for 11 years, the neighborhood where his truck with his company name on the door had been parked in that driveway dozens of times, the neighborhood where he had attended the tenant's funeral 2 doors down, the neighborhood that had just watched him get zip-tied on the lawn. Good faith. The Columbus Division of Police launched an internal investigation within 72 hours. What they found, and what their own investigators documented, was worse than the incident on Sycamore Glen Drive. They pulled the call logs for the district, 5 years of records, every 911 and non-emergency call flagged as a suspicious person or potential breaking and entering report. They ran the demographic data on the subject of each call against the responding officer's report and outcome. The numbers were not subtle. Of the 237 suspicious person calls in the Sycamore Glen Patrol District over the preceding 5 years, 179, 75%, had a black individual as the reported subject. The district's black residential population was approximately 34%. 141 of those calls resulted in officer contact with the reported subject. In 109 of the 141 contacts, the subject was found to have a legitimate reason for being where they were. 109 people investigated, questioned, in some cases physically detained, who had done nothing wrong, who were walking to their car or visiting a neighbor or opening their own door. 109 documented moments of belonging being treated as suspicion. Ezra Beaumont was 110. The investigation also examined Tyler Graves specifically. In 11 months of active patrol, he had initiated or responded to 14 suspicious person calls. 11 of those calls involved black subjects. In 10 of the 11 cases, no crime was found to have occurred or been in progress. 10 out of 11. The pattern was not ambiguous. What the investigation could not answer, and to their limited credit, the investigating officers said so explicitly in their report, was whether Graves was acting from explicit bias or from the accumulated, unexamined assumptions that training had failed to address, whether the problem was the man or the system that produced him. The attorneys representing Ezra Beaumont argued it was both, and it didn't matter which came first. The civil rights lawsuit filed by attorney Howard Pierce on behalf of Ezra Beaumont named the City of Columbus, the Columbus Division of Police, Officer Tyler Graves individually, and Officer Sandra Okafor, not as the primary aggressor, but for the specific act of deferring to a junior officer's unsupported detention decision when she had both the rank and the evidence to stop it. That last count was unusual. Howard Pierce included it deliberately, because the story of how bias operates in institutional settings is never just the story of the person who acted. It is also the story of the person who could have stopped it and didn't. The senior officer who deferred, the supervisor who filed and forgot, the administrator who saw the numbers and moved on, the neighbor who called and considered it a civic contribution. The accountability had to be wide enough to contain the whole picture. The city of Columbus settled 14 months after the lawsuit was filed, $7.2 million, plus mandatory revisions to the Columbus Division of Police's suspicious person call response protocol, requiring officers to conduct a minimum baseline verification before any physical contact with a reported subject, including checking visible business identification, vehicle registration, and making a direct inquiry of the subject themselves. The protocol was named in the department's internal documentation the Beaumont Verification Standard, his name, on a protocol in the department that zip-tied him on his lawn. Tyler Graves was terminated following the internal investigation's conclusion. His termination notice cited conduct inconsistent with constitutional standards for stop and detention, failure to conduct basic evidence assessment before use of physical restraint, and actions that created significant civil liability and reputational harm to the department. Sandra Okafor received a formal reprimand and a 30-day suspension. The department cited her failure to exercise supervisory authority to prevent an unlawful detention. She was required to complete additional training in command decision-making and constitutional stop standards. The neighbor who made the 911 call, whose name was never released publicly, faced no legal consequence. Anonymous callers to 911 are generally protected from civil liability unless malice can be proven. Howard Pierce's team explored this avenue. The legal threshold was not met. They live 2 doors from a property Ezra Beaumont still owns. He still maintains it. He still has the key. In the months after the settlement, a journalist asked Ezra Beaumont a question that he answered without hesitation, with the directness of a man who had been processing the answer for a long time. What was the hardest part? He said, the neighbors. Not the lawn, not the zip ties, not the 31 minutes of being treated as a criminal in his own property. The neighbors, the people who had seen his truck on that street for 11 years, the people who had waved at him from their porches, the people who knew his tenants, who knew the work he did, who had watched the property under his care stay maintained and occupied and respected when other properties on the street had declined. Those people had watched him on the ground, and some of them, not all, but some, had not come out, had not called out the way Gloria Simmons had called out, had watched through windows rather than from porches. I had to keep going back, he said, to the property, to do the work. I had to decide whether what happened on that lawn was going to be the story of that street or whether I was going to keep being the story of that street, the man who owns the property, the man who fixes the gutters, the man who shows up. He paused. I decided I wasn't going to let them make that lawn the last thing. So he went back, he fixed the gutters, he repaired the 3rd porch step, the one that creaked, that he'd been meaning to get to for a year. He was on that porch when the Washingtons came home from vacation. Mrs. Washington saw him and said, Mr. Beaumont, we heard what happened. Are you okay? He said, the gutters are fixed. She said, that's not what I asked. He looked at the step, at the porch, at the house he'd owned for 11 years. He said, I'm working on it. There is a document. It is not glamorous. It is not visual in the way that credentials and key fobs and DOJ badges are visual. It is paper, legal paper, county recorded, with a description of the property and the name of the owner and the date of acquisition and the signature of the clerk who processed it. The deed to the property on Sycamore Glen Drive. Ezra Beaumont has owned it for 11 years. It says so. In plain language, in a county record that any officer with a smartphone in 47 seconds could have accessed before a single zip tie was produced. The deed existed on the day Tyler Graves pulled up. The truck with the company name existed. The key ring existed. The 11 years of maintenance records existed. The 14 properties existed. The 2 decades of work existed. None of it was hidden. None of it required special access or unusual inquiry. All of it was visible, retrievable, available to anyone willing to look before acting, to anyone trained to ask before assuming, to anyone operating in a system that treated black home ownership as a default possibility rather than a claim requiring proof. The deed didn't protect him. The proof didn't protect him. The 2 decades of building didn't protect him. And here is the question, the one that should follow you out of this story and into every space you occupy, every assumption you carry, every call you consider making or not making. What does it take? What does a black man have to own, to build, to accumulate, to display, to demonstrate before the assumption of belonging is extended to him automatically, the way it is extended to others without a second thought? How many properties? How many keys? How many years on a street before your presence on that street stops being a question? And if the answer is that it never stops being a question, what does that say about what we've actually built? Not the properties, not the portfolios, not the policies that bear his name. What have we built as a society if the man with the deed still ends up face down on his own lawn? He had the key. He had the deed. He had 11 years. He had his name on the truck. He had everything, and he was still on the ground. The question that no settlement answers, what is ownership worth when the owner still has to prove he belongs? Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from, because this one is about more than a lawsuit. It's about who gets to own things in this country and what that ownership actually means. Share this before the algorithm buries it. Hit like, subscribe, and send this to someone building something, because they need to know what building while black can cost. Next week, we go deeper into another story that was almost erased. Stay with us.